This is actually a Substack article. This is by Innomen, um, and so this is just kind of talking about substrate-agnostic cognitive architectures. So I guess the name of the Substack is Underlore. And the subtitle here is Closing the Gap Between Brain Science and Deployable Cognitive Systems. So this is very much in this spirit of biologically inspired cognitive architectures, or BICA. And so this is a diagram here. It's kind of highly conceptual, but you have like this emotion core, sensory input module, motor control unit, damage detection, auditory module, language center, logic processor, visual processor. So all these different multi-sensory inputs, control inputs, and memory storage, going kind of into this network that converges upon emotion. So that's kind of the idea here. So this abstract here, decades of neuroscience has established that the brain is a collection of functionally distinct regions with identifiable inputs, outputs, and computational roles. And we go to the history of neuroscience where people have been able to localize function and measure that, and then figure out how that relates to behavior, and then more sort of relevant to some of the things we want to do with maybe AI or modeling, is to understand how they compute information. And so there's a whole field of computational neuroscience that talks about that. Simultaneously, machine learning has produced high quality implementations of many of those functions in isolation. So it's just an approximation, say, of some output behavior. Now, of course, the problem is that we don't necessarily approximate the architecture. And a lot of people would argue that, well, that's not so important because a lot of these kinds of behaviors are architecture agnostic. But, it's not necessarily always the case. It's just kind of a general statement to say I can produce, say, like an emotional state on a very small amount of hardware or on a very small substrate. So if you think back to the Bradenberg vehicles, Valentina Bradenberg basically argued that you see these things that look like emotions coming out of a very small connection, what is essentially a connection machine, between sensors and effectors. Now, of course, if that's the same type of emotions that we would experience, say, in humans, or other types of complex emotional outputs, is, that's debatable. So this idea of substrate agnosticism is, it's debatable. But the point being is that you can generate these different behaviors on different types of hardware, different types of neural substrates, etc. So then this goes on to say, yet no research program has combined both observations into their logical conclusion, which is a working cognitive system assembled from best fit substrate per region, coordinated over a shared event bus with no requirement for biological fidelity. Okay, so I guess he's saying that you could combine the outputs of different AI systems into one cognitive architecture. Okay. Existing efforts fail in one of several ways. They're substrate committed, demanding biological tissue or homogeneous tensor compute, where they are architecturally faithful but fill every module with the same kind of model. A fourth failure mode is from scratch neurosymbolic approach, which correctly identifies the learning problem but solves it by rebuilding everything rather than composing what already exists. So composition is important, where you're putting together pieces and getting them to work together. So, the idea of composition is important in linguistics, but it's also important in development, and it's important in these kinds of complex systems where you're trying to put together different aspects of, say, like a behavior. So we saw on the figure at the top here where emotion contains all of these different units and they contribute to the core. This paper characterizes the gap, surveys what is known about each major functional region, proposes clean interface contracts between regions, and then outlines the minimum credible path to working proof of concept. The required work is an engineering problem, not a scientific one, and is tractable with a small team and seed scale funding. So they're trying to sell people on this idea more so than trying to answer scientific questions. But that's okay for what we're trying to do here. So the introduction talks about the modular organization of the brain, which is not a hypothesis. Lesion studies, split brain experiments, and decades of functional imaging have produced a detailed circuit diagram of which regions handle what. Visual processing, episodic encoding, motor sequencing, executive planning, reward learning, and routing are all separable. Damage to one region produces specific predictable deficits, so they're not all interacting all the time. There is this separability between them. They can exhibit crosstalk. They can be combined into some downstream thing, but they do have their own sort of substrate. You can produce different. You can propose different substrates to get the same behavior. You also have this localization of function where if you damage one part of that substrate, you can impair this aspect of behavior. So the system is not homogeneous. Machine learning has, in parallel, produced strong implementations in many of these functions. Convolutional transformer architectures match or exceed human performance on visual recognition. Larger language models handle reasoning, planning, and language production at a level that was not expected this decade. Reinforcement learning systems learn reward-driven behavior. Vector databases provide fast associative retrieval. These are not approximations. For their target functions, they work. The logical synthesis is clear. Treat each brain region as a functional specification. Implement it with whatever substrate best fits its computational profile. Define clean interfaces between regions, and then wire them together. No one has done this. This paper asks why, characterizes the current gap in the literature, and proposes the minimum viable path forward. Okay, so then the second part is why existing approaches fall short, and it has to do with this substrate, which is what the computations run on. So in the brain, of course, our substrate is the neural architecture. So we might have a pathway with different neural centers, or we might have different neurons that do different things. In a computer, we have, maybe like a neural network or some sort of computational model that has different processing components. And the idea is that, you shouldn't need any one substrate to get the same behavior. So you can have, say, like a reinforcement learning model and a neural network, and they can give you similar outputs. The substrate being quite different, perhaps, but it gives you the same behavior. You can do computation on a number of things. And if we see this with organoids and neural cultures, where we can basically produce output behaviors for things like robots or other types of neural representations using sort of disembodied neural systems. So that's kind of the idea. So the first point here is substrate committed simulation. So he talks about the Human Brain Project and Blue Brain Project, and they pursue this biological fidelity as a primary goal. But then the problem is that you can produce a scientifically interesting output, but it doesn't provide a path to a working cognitive system on any near-term timescale. Fidelity and function are different targets. A perfect simulation of a wing does not fly. That's the criticism of this approach of mass neural simulation or emulation. The second point is substrate committed hardware. So neuromorphic machines or neuromorphic programs especially the ones committed to spike-based computation as a substrate principle, might be appropriate for some functions and entirely inappropriate for others. Spike-based computation is not a good substrate for large-scale language modeling, for example. Choosing a substrate first and then fitting the function to it inverts the correct design order. Then they talk about homogeneous machine learning architectures, where you implement every region with the same model type, typically a large language model or standard neural network. This abandons the efficiency and appropriateness gains that motivate the decomposition in the first place. So, for example, a cerebellum implemented as a 70 billion parameter language model is not a cerebellum. The cerebellum, in terms of the neural architecture, in terms of the neuroanatomy, is very specific to timing and movement and timing out things like that. And the architecture is very unsuited to a language model, or at least the language circuits that we have in biological brains. Then this fourth point, neurosymbolic from scratch approaches. So this just talks about the failure modes of neurosymbolic architectures. They correctly identify that frozen statistical models cannot perform real-time incremental learning, correctly reject the patch and LLM approach, and correctly center knowledge representation as the architectural backbone. The result is a system capable of one-shot learning, but then the failure mode is actually strategic, building every cognitive mechanism from scratch, including the knowledge graph, the learning engine, etc., into a single integrated system requires rebuilding what already exists at a considerable cost over a long timeline. The fifth point is the whole brain architecture exception, which is this whole brain architecture initiative. And this is something that is also what they're proposing in this paper. It separates the reference architecture from the component implementation and develops them independently. And then this is just talking about how this might work and how this might be an exception to all these problems. The gap is not scientific. We know what each region does. The gap is that no one has treated the system. This is a systems engineering project with the appropriate interface discipline. Okay, so then it goes on to talk about different functional specifications by region, the integration layer, the learning loop, tool use and agency, then the minimum viable path to this. So what are the steps that you need to implement? So step 1 is writing the interface specification. Step 2 is implementing the bus and prefrontal module. Step 3 is adding the hippocampal and thalamic modules. Step 4 is adding the sensory and basal ganglia module, so adding in these different components of the quote-unquote brain, these homogeneous or heterogeneous components. And then step 5 is evaluation and publication of the proof of concept. Then this is just kind of, so it's kind of an outline of a thing that they want to do, but it also, I think, hits on a number of really good points about this kind of approach. So the conclusion is that a substrate-agnostic interface for systems and engineering approach to cognitive architectures is tractable. The brain is a collection of parts. We know what those parts do. We have good implementations of most of them, but getting them assembled into one heterogeneous system is the problem.